So it's about enabling creativity, enabling artists, and realizing that enabling is possible regardless of what you look like, how you use your senses, what your sensory priority is, whether you walk or roll.
So what steps can individual artists in the community, ones who, live in a traditionally abled box, do to promote these accessible workspaces, practices, performances with either their institution that they work with or their community or with the government?
Well, I suppose individuals can start to imagine in the way that we're talking about, so that when they create their art, they think, who is this art for? So, for example, Erin Ball, who's a wonderful circus performer and an individual artist, an independent artist, although she also runs Kingston Circus Arts. But she now, in her practice, when she creates a piece of theater, a performance piece, she is now engaging with the practice of description. She often will describe herself, sometimes as she is performing. She and I have been working on creating a whole new kind of approach to audio description that is specific to circus, because circus is so visual and physical. And so we're coming up with a kind of more poetic way of describing movement. She's also explored recording her voice and having that recording played while she's performing. She has also been exploring the use of a narrator in her pieces, so that the pieces become almost part of like coming out of a book that a person is reading on stage as she's performing. So she's looking at all sorts of different creative ways to make this highly visual form and highly physical form of performance accessible for audiences who are blind. So I guess that's an example, and that's a way to answer your question about what an individual artist can do. They can ask themselves these questions that we've been asking. And right from the start, in terms of when you're putting that grant in, you don't have to know how it's all going to unfold. But if you include the idea that you imagine audiences engaging through differing senses, and so you ask for support in order to pursue that. So again, we're coming back to this whole idea of thinking of it right from the beginning.
This moment is an interesting one to be an individual artist. What does an individual art person do at all in the world is, I think, something we're all asking ourselves and struggling with, given that it feels like there are massive things happening in the world all the time. So much of it feels outside of our control, and yet there's so much that needs to be done. There's so many crises. This particular conversation around accessibility, I think the thing that the role the individual has is to educate yourself, to increase your consciousness, to raise your awareness level. And it's not like there isn't people out there. It's not like there isn't resources out there. There's lots and lots of places to look if you are interested. And then with that, raise awareness and consciousness to advocate and to be outraged and to not lose that, target your self-righteousness towards something that needs it. And I think, we're seeing a little bit of that with the heightened racial awareness that I'm seeing in my white colleagues in the sector around race, around Black and Indigenous relationships in particular, and a level of, I think, heightened awareness where there's almost a unwillingness now to accept status quo anymore. And it's going to force institutions to change. It's going to force governments to change. It's going to force funders to change, because there is enough of a critical mass of unhappy people, unhappy constituents. And this issue, I think, the real seismic shift is going to come from funding. It's going to come from policy. It's going to come from opening up access, funding, so that we can have a different level of participation, especially in the world that we live in, where it's becoming increasingly expensive to make access possible for communities that have different needs. And the more different communities you're trying to serve, the more different ways that happens. And if that doesn't happen at a policy level, if that investment doesn't happen at the funding level, no amount of values is going to overcome that missing piece of the puzzle. So directing your energy towards that and holding your politicians accountable and holding your funders accountable and you're holding your institutions accountable and having that set of values integrated in your practice in who you choose to work with and don't work with, and asking questions when you do get hired by companies of like, what's your commitment to that, and what work have you done on it? And you know what, maybe I don't want to work with company X who doesn't really honor that commitment, or doesn't even have a plan in place.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Owais, that you're making about decisions about who we work with as independent individual artists, and deciding, is that company actually going to execute the kind of accessibility outreach, the kind of effort, also the kind of long-term commitment to it. I think that's one of the things that has been happening in the past, perhaps, is this kind of, okay, we did it once, so that's great. We've sort of, I hate to say it, tick that box, because that's a phrase that's used over and over and over again. But it's also looking at long-term evolution of organizations. And so I know this isn't something that an individual artist can necessarily know, but you can sort of see how an organization is evolving over time. And are you the only person from, let's say, the disability community that is being invited to participate? And are there people in the decision-making positions? Are there people in directorships or in positions of leadership that are part of the company that represent your values? So it's not just about accepting an opportunity, but maybe using the opportunity as well to say, okay, I'm here now. Who's coming next? How can we learn from each other from this opportunity? When I've worked at companies in the past, it's usually a huge learning opportunity for the organization to actually understand the shifts, not just in having me in the space, but how do you communicate to the blind community? Do you have audio flyers? How often are you providing sighted support? You know, all the different aspects of the ways that an organization connects to the community can shift. And as individual artists, we have an impact on that, but also we are providing a kind of education that I think should be recognized and paid for. And I guess there's often a lot of unrecognized labor that occurs when a disabled person, a person with a disability, is perhaps the first into an organization. And the impact that individual can have is great, but also there's often so much educating that they have to do in order to make the space safe. So I guess what I'm getting at is that individuals have a power, but also they need to make sure that education side of what they can offer is being remunerated and recognized. Because I get worried about burnout. I hear from so many artists from the disability community that they just feel burnt out because they feel like everywhere they go, they're not only the artist, but they're the educator, and they're responsible for bringing the company sort of up to their needs. So I think it's really helpful to be aware of the organization that you're going into, both for your own, sense of protection, but also have a conversation and say, I'm really happy. This is a great opportunity, but because this is a new endeavor for the organization, how much educating is going to be needed? Do you want me to do that? If so, let's put it into the contract, or let's get somebody else in, so that it's not all, resting on that one individual artist.
I want to shift for a moment to education, but specifically in high school and theater school context. I think it's fair to say that in most theater schools, especially in this country, there is not that consciousness of accessibility. I mean, there are so many barriers to accessibility when it comes to post-secondary education. What kind of shift do we need to help them become more conscious?
The priority at the moment is ensuring that at the high school level, that people with disabilities are being encouraged to consider themselves artists and consider a profession in the arts, because mostly they're not. So that's a real problem, because if they're not encouraged, then it's less likely that they're going to pursue the level of training that I think you're referring to, like theater schools. Certainly, I think it would be very helpful for the faculty at theater schools across Canada if the faculty could engage in accessible performing arts education training, where they can actually imagine what it is that they're practicing and how that could be communicated to a person who engages in a different way. So for example, voice teachers teaching a person who has a differing speech pattern. And what by differing speech pattern, I'm referring to somebody whose speech is affected for differing reasons, and therefore perhaps they don't articulate their P's and their D's and their, you know, their consonants in the way that someone with a more traditional speech pattern would. And so what are our expectations? If you're a voice teacher, what are you expecting from your students? Are you expecting them, is that it? Is that the most important thing, that they get those consonants sharp? Or is there a more essential purpose to voice education? Is it about liberating a person's voice so that they can be the best communicators of their imagination and their emotions and their creativity? You know, that doesn't mean that they're not speaking someone else's text. They may very well be. In fact, using Hamlet as an example, I taught a man with a differing speech pattern he wanted to do the famous speech from Hamlet. His voice changed, not because he was trying to pronounce the words correctly, but because he was engaging so deeply with the imagery of that text. He had experienced times in his life when he was considering ending his life, and he chose that text because it was connected to him. So my job as his voice teacher was to help him engage as deeply with that text as possible. And in terms of how he then communicated it with his voice, it was more about how the thoughts and the images were being communicated through his breathing and through his sound. He could make sound. It's just his speech was not going to be clear. And we used graphics, and we used a screen with words on it, and we had images to help support what he was saying for an audience who might need a little bit more of more input in terms of images on a screen in order to follow his speech. So I think having some time with faculty so that they can reimagine what their practice is and how their practice can land differently with students with differing abilities.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting moment for training institutions for a lot of reasons. And one thing I've been thinking a lot about recently, watching some of the training institutions get called out for different kinds of things on social media and conversations around them, is really, I think there's a much deeper fundamental questioning happening of what is the purpose of these places and why do they exist and what are they here for? And I think this conversation is tied into that larger conversation too. And for the training institutions, probably there's going to be a period of some really deep questioning needed and some dismantling and rebuilding of ideas that have shaped a lot of what's problematic about Western European colonial theater practices, and that has meant accessibility a lack of accessibility for a lot of different people for a lot of different reasons in different times. What we still persist to see, I think, is like the very seeds of that notion of the canon and the seeds of the idea of like molding an actor through a conservatory training program to become this ideal vision of an actor. Like there's some very, very fundamental first principles, I think, in Eurocentric training that like need to be re-examined. Not all of them are bad. Like some of them are probably still helpful to keep, but like a whole bunch of them, you know, I think we need a new constitution basically for training. This conversation, this awareness is going to be super important in that, around what does it mean to engage people of different abilities, and starting with the first consciousness change of like, we're all differently able. Like there is the first thing Alex said, I think we have to go back to, which is there is no such thing as like able-bodied and disabled people. Really, like we're all on a spectrum, and at different times in my life, I have been completely helpless. All I could do was shit my pants all day and cry. And I didn't have, the same ability that I have now. And there will be a time in my life where I won't be able to see as well or hear as well. And like even within one's able-bodied life, there are so many moments where you have different levels of ability. And once we start really like seeing individuals and seeing the diversity there of needs and of possibilities, we can actually design a world that wasn't, so much of our world it just boils down to, it was all designed for straight white supermen. And
yes.
We're unpacking a lot of that right now and going, how do we make the world for a few more people than that?
Totally. Yes. When we use the language around this conversation, you know, the language of ability or disability, I really like to think of it in simple terms, that we are enabling people to reach their potential, fulfill their potential, or we're disabling people from doing so. And it goes back to that needs met, needs not met. So it's really, it's about enabling creativity, enabling artists, and realizing that enabling is possible regardless of what you look like, how you use your senses, what your sensory priority is, whether you walk or roll. Those of us who have positions right now of leadership or of teaching or policymakers, our job is to consider becoming better enablers. And it's funny, we used to use the word enable in a kind of negative way. We thought of enabling people was this negative thing, right? Yeah. Like enabling bad behavior. And I say, no, let's enable good behavior. Let's enable artistry.
What are some resources you'd recommend to viewers who want to learn more about the things we're discussing?
Alex Bulmer.
Thank you for saying that. Same back at you. Probably Tangled Art and Disability also has some good resources, good material online. They are more focused on galleries and visual art, but they also have a performance lab. And then, you can go to organizations in Europe. I mentioned Shape Arts. They've got a fantastic website with all sorts of really interesting and really useful information in terms of audience access. And there is also quite a good international database that the British Council has put together. It is a database of artists with disabilities or organizations that are disabled led from all over the world. And it's pretty great to look at, because you suddenly realize, oh my God, look what's possible.
Those are all great ones. I don't have really much to add.
I liked your first one.
No, I legit, I think we got to go to people who are living it, are experts in it, and pay them the same rate we pay fancy strategic consultants, because that's what this is. This is very high level knowledge that took a lifetime to learn, and then to actually be able to package that knowledge in a way that's usable for somebody else is a very high level skill. And we talked a little bit earlier about the labor that goes into being the first in a space, and I really think more and more there is an awareness around this. It's happening, but we need to just start calling it what it is, which is when you bring in your first person of color, you bring in your first Indigenous person, you bring in your first blind artist, you need to recognize that you are not equipped to work with them yet, and there is work that's going to be done there, and maybe they want to do that work, maybe they don't, and that shouldn't be. Unfortunately, we put so much of that kind of impetus on the person who's just so lucky and so grateful to just even get this opportunity, and that power dynamic is unfortunate, because it's not on them. It should be on the organization, on the institution, on the person who's done the excluding for so long to fund the change that they're making, and not use the free labor. And unfortunately, lots of artists are going to be willing to do it because they are so desperate to get opportunities. Every artist I know just wants to get their work out there. Very few of them are going, I don't know, I'm going to pass on that opportunity to make my work just because I'm going to have to do some educating. Or maybe even are very passionate about doing that educating work, but it's work, and let's recognize that and give that the validity. And if an artist really doesn't want that, also recognize that shouldn't have to be their job, and you should have to hire another person to do that work.
Alex, Owais, thank you both so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure talking to you both. So enlightening and so helpful, and I think there's so many actionable things that people can take away from this. So thank you both.
Yeah, thank you. And I will be in touch, Owais, about this whole galvanizing around access to work, access to life.
I love it. Let's go wreck some shit.
Let's go. Let's go wreck some shit. Can that be how we finish today? Can that be the last thing that we hear on the tape?
True say, somebody y'all don't like your ass on that jury, you ain't getting no money, bro. somebody going to find a really nice way to undercut you. And everybody works to try to avoid that. But still, you know, if I'm sitting on a project jury and somebody comes up and says, oh yeah, I really want to do new and innovative Shakespeare in abandoned spaces in the city, it's just